Joined now by Arwa Damon in Kabul, the president and founder of Inara, a non-profit that provides access to life-altering medical and mental health care to children impacted by human-induced or natural disasters. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme as we continue our rolling coverage. You know, you're seeing for yourself as well these images of these first trucks going into Gaza now. I mean, what is the emotion that it's sparking in you? And is this where, you know, this is the moment where now people like you have to mobilize yourself?
You know, it's a sense of finally, and it's also a sense of frustration because clearly there was the capacity to be able to increase humanitarian assistance without quite literally bringing the population in Gaza to its knees and trying to crush it, whether through, hunger or starvation or deprivation of just basic services. The thing that is still quite concerning, though, is that, of those trucks going across, there are roughly 50 trucks that are anticipated to be fuel. And fuel is very critical because it has been, and there has been, an extreme shortage of fuel across the Gaza Strip. However, 50 trucks of fuel is not necessarily enough to be able to supply the hospitals, the desalination plants, and all of the trucks that are going to be needed to then be able to distribute everything that is coming across. So while there is, yes, this great sense of relief, there's also the sense of, we need to keep up the pressure. And it's not just about the humanitarian aid going into Gaza. It's very important to remember this, too. It's also about being able to medically evacuate people out. That is expected to happen, hopefully in a week or so if all of this holds, because there are many critical cases that are in hospital. There's a waiting list of thousands of names. But just to give you one example, Inara, along with a number of other organizations, has been, working with and following the case of this one little girl named Habiba. She's 2.5 years old. She actually has a very rare but treatable condition that is known as protein C deficiency. But what this is doing is causing her blood to overclot, and her limbs and her extremities are becoming gangrenous. So she is very much at risk of losing her fingers, her foot, and she's just one case that needs to immediately be able to get out of Gaza. So while, yes, we look at these images of the trucks rolling in and there is this sense of relief, there's also the sense of, we can't let the pressure up right now. And the staff on the ground is very aware of how much work lies ahead for them. Actually, our program coordinator messaged me yesterday saying, I originally thought that this, and by this she means the ceasefire, would be the time when we could go down to our knees and cry and mourn. But I'm realizing that this is when we're going to have to try to buckle up and work even harder.
Now, Arwa, I want to draw upon the experiences of your non-profit that, of course, provides this, mental health care to children. Now, given what you say, you gave that example of that little girl who could have, limbs of hers amputated. Having her life will be so significantly, altered if she survives this war. How are you able to help that, a child like that and their families?
It really depends on where the child and the family end up. We constantly say that what we're able to do while the trauma triggers are still ongoing is very limited, because you can't do the sort of in-depth mental health work that is required to allow a person, whether that's an adult or a child, be able to really move through the pain, because you can't ask a child or an adult to sort of rip open that which is painful if you cannot guarantee that you're going to be there to help them close that wound back up. So a lot of what we've been doing for the past, 15 months when it comes to the mental health space is trying to prevent a deterioration and also trying to provide a little bit of a distraction. So a lot of the mental health and psychosocial activities end up centering around play, but also around giving children different tools to be able to cope with, the various traumatic triggers that are happening around them all the time, and the various traumas that they had experienced in the past. But we need to actually, wait and see where we're going to be able to move specifically within the mental health space. Now, when a child is actually out of Gaza, or rather away from trauma and triggers, that is when you can begin the real in-depth work. So we have an example of a little girl who's in our program in Egypt, and she survived a bombing because her mother was cradling her. And her mother died, effectively saving her own life. Her father, completely traumatized by all of this, sort of lost his mind, effectively forgot that he had children, forgot what his own name was. And so this little girl was in the care of her aunt in Egypt. And when she first came into our program, she was completely nonverbal. But after intensive work, and we're talking, intensive over the course of months, with our professionals, she began to engage. She began to engage with other children. So when we're specifically talking about, the mental health of children, it's very much dependent on the conditions that are around them, the conditions where they find themselves, and what sort of stability actually exists within those conditions before we can actually start giving them the tools to be able to move forward. And we don't, I at least don't like talking about healing from this kind of trauma, because you don't ever heal from this kind of trauma. But what you can do is learn how to live with the trauma. And what you can do is learn how to soften the scars of the hurt and your pain so that they don't end up blocking you from being able to move forward with your life.
But I mean, how difficult is it for, agencies like yourselves? I mean, when 14,500 children have been killed, I mean, the trauma of those people that survive, the children especially who survive, will be immense. So is it also important to allow them to restart their normal practices, things like going back to school, so at least they're in an environment that takes their minds off the scars that they have?
Exactly. And so that is very critical. And, I call it kind of pillars of stability. So, family and home, access to education are two key pillars of stability, especially for a child. The reality is that in Gaza, those don't exist, especially not at this point in time. And when they do start to exist again, they're going to look very, very different to what a child used to experience. I've been listening to some interviews with children talking about what the first thing they're looking forward to do. And they're saying things like, I want to sleep in my bed. I want to sleep in a room by myself. I want to pack my school bag and go back to my classroom. Thing is for the vast majority of them, home no longer exists. They're still going to be in some sort of a tented existence. And schools right now are still going to most likely have to continue to be shelters as, people realize that it's extremely difficult to live on top of the rubble, of what was your home. And so getting an education program and getting, Gaza's sort of education infrastructure up and running is going to be extremely difficult. And that has already been shifting over the course of, the last month since all of this has been happening into these makeshift educational tents. Reality has been so drastically altered for everyone in Gaza that in many ways there is no going back to what was before. And this is something that is very difficult for even adults to come to terms with, because the Gaza that the population is going to have to live in and rebuild, that's not going to be the Gaza of before. The Gaza of before is quite literally, tragically, devastatingly gone. And we also need to recognize that when we're talking about, the mental health space, but even just the humanitarian space, or about the medical professionals and the journalists, they have all been people from Gaza living the very same traumas of those who they are either trying to report on or those who they are trying to treat or assist. And so the burden, the weight of all of this on everybody is just, it's extraordinary. And for the last 15 months, the vast majority of people have had to shove down all of this pain, literally pour metaphorical concrete on top of it so that they could keep surviving. Now that concrete is going to crack, and they're going to have to face a tsunami of emotions of hurt and pain and loss.
Indeed, and that was the final question that I wanted to talk to you about. I mean, as you said, we can rebuild Gaza, you can paper over all of these cracks, but the mental scars for these people will be so immense, especially for, of course, young children. Now, we know that therapy can take years, it can take a lifetime, but what would be your minimum goals when it comes to alleviating some of the trauma that people in Gaza will, of course, face for perhaps the rest of their lives?
We sort of have a barometer, at least, at Inara, in terms of when we feel like a case, so our work with the child has been successful. And that barometer, whether it's in, the medical work that we do, the reconstructive surgeries, the prosthetics, or in the mental health space, is the point where the child realizes that they're able to regain agency over their own life. And by that, I mean the physical and or psychological injury that they have been through is no longer an obstacle to that child recognizing that they can still chart a path for themselves of their own choosing. And the different elements of that are, something as basic as access to education. So a child is no longer so traumatized or so physically inhibited due to the injury that they are not able to go to school, or something very basic like, hold a pencil or interact with their peers or focus on their studies, but rather that they have reached a point where they, as I was saying, have agency over their own life and the direction that they want to see it taking. But yes, this is something that takes years and years of work. And this is exactly why, for so many different reasons, the international community cannot and should not abandon Gaza at this stage, because Gazans have been extraordinary, really, throughout the last 15 months in helping each other. I cannot tell you the number of times when, you're seeing these sort of small community-led efforts that are by the people for the people, but they can't keep carrying this burden of survival by themselves. And actually, when it comes to mental health, a big part of that is feeling as if you're not alone. I mean, imagine going through everything that we have been talking about, everything that you all have been reporting on, and feeling and knowing that the world has been watching this and has effectively abandoned you. And that also rips open yet another severe psychological injury as well.
It does indeed. Well, listen, Arwa Damon, I do hope that, as you said, the international community doesn't desert Gaza, which is quite ironic in the location where you are, where, of course, we saw them desert, especially the women of Afghanistan. It's been a fascinating conversation, but we will leave it there. Arwa Damon in Kabul, the president and founder of Inara.